Hi everyone, so I'm back with another throwing video. Today we're going to be doing a cylinder. Yesterday we did a bowl, so if you haven't seen that one, do go back and have a look, because I'm not going to repeat myself too much, although I will give a refresher. So again, I'm starting with I'm going to throw on a bat today. I mean, I could probably lift this off, but I'd like to show you a few different techniques which is going to loosen the body so much that I don't want to have to try and lift that off afterwards. So I'm going to throw on a bat again. The clay bat is still soft. It's always wrapped up after every session, so I just keep the same one on. I'm just cleaning and dampening down the back of my bat. I'm going to roughly align that in the middle and set the wheel spinning. When you're attaching a bat to a clay, a bat out section on a wheel head, it's always worth keeping the wheel moving and bashing right from the centre. I've seen it so many times when people are starting out that they bash on one side, and what that does is it can compress the clay pad underneath, and it stops it being even, and then your hands are kind of doing this the whole time when you're centering. It's not great. So I would always recommend just having the wheel moving and a good bash down right from the centre of the bat. Seems to do a job for you. So cleaning up that bat. When you're working on the bat or the wheel head, it's always best to clean it down, because you don't want a dusty surface. But then I always use my thumb as a squeegee just to take off any kind of leftover slurry there, because you don't want it wet either. If there's any wet or slurry in between there, you're going to get a kind of slippy barrier between the clay and the wheel head or the bat, which is highly likely going to see the clay flying off quite quickly. So I've got 2 kilos of wedged up clay here. It's kind of I spiral wedge, and then as I'm wedging I start to do less and less and less until I'm almost just rolling it, and I kind of roll it into a bit of a cone shape, and I always slap the surface to take out any creases. I always say it's like starting with a blank canvas. So we're going right into the middle, again patting it in as close to centre as possible, using 2 hands to pat, so one on the top, one at the bottom, and that just helps to kind of knock it in. So we're going to do some centering. Again, if you didn't see the previous video, have a little look back at that, explain it in a little bit more depth. But essentially we're going to use the heel of the left hand as our anchor point, a hook with right hand, and we're going to squeeze between the two. The clay comes up naturally on its own. You can move the whole thing as one, a bit higher and higher again. You don't really need to try and lift, you don't want to move them all together up the pot. It's a little bit awkward, it's better to do it in sections really. Centre of the palm of the right hand on the top right hand corner. The reason for that is if we put it on the top, it doesn't really know where it's to sit, so if it's just off to one side, it's a bit easier. And I mentioned it yesterday that you're almost bending the clay over, but I didn't show you how much it can tolerate. So you kind of bend it over, and that left heel comes in as the anchor point and stops it from going anywhere else. So I do this a few times. Lots of pressure in down the base. Again, the closer it feels, just do the action less and less until you're just doing it inside your hands really. And we've got pint glass, karate chop, flatten off that top. Now yesterday we went in with 3 fingers because we wanted quite a broad opening for the base of the bowl, but today I'm just going to go with 2. So I'm using the thumb here as a bridge, and if this is Scout's honour, I'm going to send the Scouts over the bridge to find the middle. So what we're looking to do is just get a little kind of almost like a little nipple running between the index and middle finger. That's quite extreme, but I'm just doing that so you can get a feel for it. And then I'm just going to start applying pressure down with the pads of my fingertips, so that I'm just letting them bend backwards rather than cutting through the clay. I'm compressing that clay down to the base. So we've still got our kind of pint glass here. This is quite a large lump of clay, so it's a bit more open, more a tankard than a pint. So I'm moving it from kind of 9 o'clock on the clock face around to 6 o'clock on the clock face, so it's right in front of my body. Again, I'm not squeezing with this thumb, it's just there mainly to support the inside hand. So whenever your hands can touch, it's best to make them touch, and then you can move the whole thing as one unit. So my fingers are now straight in the bottom because I want a square interior, so I'm going to pull out straight to give myself a nice flat bottom. I've stopped about 1 centimetre to 1.5 centimetres away from that base, and I'm going to open it out a good inch wider than it needs to be. And the reason for that is, more often than not, when people are throwing cylinders, they end up with hidden weight in the bottom there, and that's because they haven't decided the internal parameters of the base of the pot. They just kind of put the hole in and then they think about everything from the outside perspective, but actually when we're throwing we should be thinking about everything from the inside perspective, because we can trim the outside, we can alter the outside later, but all of the throwing aspects should be really considering the inside of something. So I'm really going to spend some time making sure that my internal proportions are just right, that I've got a nice right angle in that bottom of there, and that I've compressed and flattened the clay out in the bottom. So it's the foundation for your entire pot, so it's worth spending some time on. People who, particularly beginners, are really kind of into getting on to the next stages, but it's worth spending some time now. Just let the wheel do the work and just move your hands back and forth with a sponge to compress that clay in the bottom, and that'll reduce 90% of the chance of it cracking later on. So now, for those of you who are fortunate enough to be brought up in Britain in the 90s, you'll definitely know the Generation Game. It was a TV show where they used to wheel on a wheel as a challenge every now and then, and people would sit and they'd have a hand either side and go a bit like this and try and make a pot. Now I always say we never ever do that when you're actually making a pot, apart from this stage. So I call this Generation Game hands. So it's one on each side, and it's literally just to gently squeeze that whole kind of base back into the width that you want the pot to be. So I'm ignoring the outside shape and size because that is completely disguised by the thickness of the clay. I'm just looking at the inside profile. By bringing all that back in, what you kind of do is, if you imagine it was a bit like that before, and you bring it back in to that, you end up with a really nice right angle in there that you can't get any other way than putting a tool in there. And it also sort of sits the weight of the wall above the base, which for my thinking just makes it a little bit stronger. But you know, somebody with a science degree could probably prove me wrong in that one, but it feels good to me anyway, and it really allows me to control the width of that base. So again, we're going to start doing some lifting now. So we're going to start with the crab claw at 5 o'clock here, and the trigger finger here. So make a gun, pull the trigger, turn it once to the side, turn it once to the front, bring the two together so that they meet up. First knuckle to thumb tip, and last knuckle to thumb tip up here, and the wall sits in between there. So it's a squeeze from the outside in, keeping it quite firm, but moving my hands slowly, moving them completely as one unit. You know, you could do this 2 or 3 times. I like to do the majority of the heavy lift in one move, but you could do that 2 or 3 times. It's absolutely fine. Every now and then I might just put some of the slurry off my hands onto the pot, so I'm not using so much water. I'm kind of infamous when I'm teaching to use a lot of water, and that's the way I throw, because I throw very quickly. But actually, if you're not throwing very quickly, then the slurry is a much better thing to use. I quite like clean water when I'm throwing a lot of stuff, but slurry it's a better tool really. I just like the water because there's less to scrape off the sides later on, and it makes it slightly quicker for me if I'm in production. But it's been a while since I've been in production, so here we are. So now I'm going to tip to tip. So I've got my left middle fingertip on the inside, my right middle fingertip on the outside, using the pads, not the actual ends, and I'm just gently squeezing and lifting. So I'm going to do one, and then we're going to do that undercut to get the hidden weight again. So the wheel's still moving moderately quickly, but my hands are moving very slowly so that my throwing rings are more like the grooves on a record than a visible spiral. So I'm just going to do a little bit of collaring. So again, this is strangle hands, so think of a shirt collar. If you imagine you're wringing someone's neck, that's your hand position. So we're starting off with sort of triangle between the hands right on the flat of the wheel head, and then slowly bringing in a finger at a time, moving up the pot to bring it all in. And this is just to keep it narrow, because it's very easy for it to flare out, so it's better to kind of catch it in the early stages and keep it narrow than it is to try and bring it back in too much if it's got particularly wide later on. So now we're going to undercut that base to get some of the weight out. So to do that, again, just so you can see, I would always work around here, but it's not very good for you to see, so I'm working over here so you can see it. Make this kind of shelf by undercutting there, and don't try and lift that at all, just squeeze it into the wall. So I'm squeezing that, lots of pressure from the outside to the in, and then slowly bringing that weight up the wall. So if you did watch the bowl video yesterday, you'll know a lot of this because it's very similar. The main difference is that at the moment we've got a square interior at the base rather than a curved one that we had for the bowl. So again, undercut the base, squeeze the shelf into the wall, and slowly bring that weight up the wall. Now I'm going to make this cylinder a lot thinner than I did the cylinder for the bowl, because when you're making a bowl and you're going to open it out, the clay is going to stretch, so you need a little bit of weight left in there to be able to stretch that clay. But for a cylinder, you don't need as much really, you just need a thickness that's just thick enough to hold the whole thing up really. So I'm looking down at the internal width of my base because that's kind of the parameter that I set for how wide I want this pot to be. So I know that up here it's considerably wider than it is down there at the moment, so I'm going to just go in and do a little bit more collaring. I know somebody is going to probably ask how tall this is, so I would say it's definitely at least 30 centimeters, probably about 34 or something. I haven't got a tape handy, but yeah, it's slightly more than 30 at this stage from 2 kilos of clay, so it's definitely possible, and it's probably about 10 centimeters wide. Now you could make this thinner, but I want to show you a few variations now. So I'm going to just square off the base using my square metal kidney, and then I'm just going to run a fingertip up the inside of the pot against that kidney to take away the slurry, even out the wall, compress and, you know, tidy everything up, consolidate all of your throwing rings. Working with the rib is really kind of important if you want anything to be absolutely solid and straight. You can do pretty much everything with your fingers if you're happy with that kind of aesthetic, but if you want something that's going to be a bit more kind of durable, robust, maybe with fitting parts or anything like that, then you can't underestimate the value of spending some time working with a rib. And to be honest, I would do it regardless. Even if you want it to look very handmade, I would kind of fake that in afterwards and make sure that your foundation was actually very sturdy like this. So, utensil pot, chimney pot, whatever you want. This is your base for a cylinder. But a cylinder is the kind of basic form for anything that's upright, really. So I'm going to show you a couple of variations of how you could adapt this a little bit. Just going to get some water. Hold on one sec. Sometimes it just has to be a little bit more watery for me. That's more like it. So we're going to try putting a little bit of shape into this now. So a little bit like we did with the bowl yesterday, I'm just going to use one finger on the inside, again supported with the fingers beside it, and a rib on the outside. And I'm just going to gently allow that to start coming out a little, and then I'll use that rib. Perhaps I should have a curved one, really. I'll use the rib. I'll use the rib just here to bring up into a shoulder, and to turn a shoulder into a neck, and then we can collar in a neck a little bit. You always have to be very careful about the profile of a shoulder. You see, if it's too much, it'll start to collapse like this. But if you think of the kind of architecture of an arch and have a more broad curve, you'll be able to support quite a lot of weight above it. So you really need to consider the form a little bit there. Soft, sweeping, subtle curves rather than sudden changes of pace. So you can see we've expanded the cylinder now. We've got a very obvious kind of shoulder and a neck and a lip, and this is the kind of time that you could maybe turn something like this into a jug. Now, for me, I quite like a very simple lip. I just turn out the clay with a fingertip, and if you turn it just over itself, over that straight point, you'll get quite a nice pour on that. But there are still other things we could do with this, so if jugs don't float your boat, we can pop that back in. Let's have a play around. You can maybe start to make more of a belly down here. You could have it, you know, multiple layered forms if you like that kind of thing. Continue to bring that out. Just supporting that kind of turn in for the neck with a finger on the inside while you're playing with the form on the out. Now we've got a much more bellied kind of jar-like shape, so you know you could do something with a lid, something like this. If you had a shorter neck, you could belly this a bit more and make it into a teapot base. So anything that's that kind of more upright kind of shape it all starts its life as a cylinder and then starts to get the shape in afterwards. So you do have to consider where you leave the thickness. If I wanted this belly to come right out to here, I would have had to have left a bit extra thickness in the middle, so that when it spreads, it accounts for that. But realistically, the vast majority of things, if you can throw a good cylinder, you can then work with it afterwards and really change that form into whatever it is you're thinking about. So let's just do a couple more bits to this, and then we'll leave it for the day. Let's see how far we can push this. Doesn't like that. No. So this is my little turned over knife tool. It's just cut on a grinder. Actually, I think I cut it with a hacksaw to start with, and then bent it over in a vise, cut it on a grinder. Again, they're commercially available, but I stole this one from the Royal College of Art canteen. I don't condone stealing, but needs must sometimes when you're a poor student. And it's just great for being able to take off a bit of excess weight at the base. Don't want to take so much that you kind of hinder the integrity of the pot, but enough while it's soft that it saves you working too hard on it when it's leather and you've got it upside down on quite a fine rim. You know, if I'm going to turn this on that rim, which is fine, which I would still do, then you don't want to have to do too much work down there really. So the more you can do in the throwing, the less you have to do in the turning, and the less chance you've got of spoiling those kind of nice touches. Also, I mean, things like the rim could do with a little bit of sponging, but I wouldn't do that just now. I'll wait until it's leather and then I'll run a sponge around it by hand. It makes much more sense. The amount of pots that get ruined from fiddling right in the last stages is unbelievable. So I'll wire it off and I'll give you a little look at it, and I'll see you another time for another video. Thanks very much.